Have you ever paused to wonder how an organization as massive and, well, globally active as the Department of Defense manages its environmental footprint, all while maintaining, peak efficiency in its operations?
It's a pretty staggering challenge when you really think about it.
Totally.
I
Yeah.
mean, you consider the sheer scale, the variety of their activities, everything from like admin functions in some local office right up to global military ops and huge construction projects.
Yeah,
The potential environmental impact is just immense.
exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive into that fascinating world, specifically how the Department of Defense, the DoD, handles its environmental responsibilities under the National Environmental Policy Act. We'll just call it NEPA.
Right, NEPA.
And we're going to focus on a, frankly, powerful tool they use to streamline this whole process, categorical exclusions, or CATEXs.
Yeah, CATEX. So our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack these regulations that might seem kind of dry on the surface and uncover the surprising details of how the DoD actually balances its critical operations with environmental responsibilities. We'll show you how they sort of fast-track certain activities without necessarily compromising environmental integrity.
And find those surprising facts hidden inside, right?
Exactly. What's hidden in these detailed procedures? Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to understanding how one of the world's largest entities manages its environmental impact.
And to do that, we're drawing directly from the DoD's own playbook, their official NEPA implementing procedures, and Appendix A, which actually lists out all the various CATEX.
Yeah, these aren't just, dry legal texts. They really offer a window into the practical, real-world application of environmental policy, and at a truly vast operational scale.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Maybe start with the big picture.
Okay.
What's NEPA's core purpose for the DoD?
Okay. Primarily, it's about integrating environmental considerations into all DoD decision-making. That's the key.
Right.
The overarching goal is to make sure relevant environmental information is identified and considered early, really early, so decisions are truly informed.
Makes sense.
And their procedures aim for reviews that are coordinated, consistent, predictable, and crucially timely. A key objective is definitely to reduce unnecessary burdens and delays in their critical operations.
Yeah, you can't have everything grinding to a halt for every little thing. But I imagine not every single action the DoD takes needs a full-blown environmental analysis, right?
Oh, absolutely not. So there are specific times when a NEPA review just isn't required.
Like when?
Well, if the activity isn't a final agency action under the Administrative Procedure Act, for instance, or if it's legally exempt from NEPA by some other law.
Yeah.
It also wouldn't apply if doing the review would fundamentally conflict with another law. Or, and this is interesting, if Congress has already set criteria that leave the DoD with essentially no discretion to change its action based on environmental factors.
So if their hands are legally tied anyway.
Precisely. It's like a mandatory function they simply must carry out. NEPA doesn't apply then.
Got it.
Also, if another existing law's requirements already do the job of NEPA compliance, or if the proposed action isn't considered a major federal action, and that term is specific, both major and federal action have to be present.
Okay, not just one or the other.
Right. And actions with really minimal federal funding or involvement, where the federal agency just can't control the outcome, those are exempt too. And kind of a meta point, the official issuance of the DoD's own NEPA procedures, that itself isn't subject to NEPA review.
Okay.
And it's important to remember the DoD usually considers only the specific action or project right in front of them when deciding if NEPA applies. Keeps the scope manageable.
Okay, so let's say NEPA does apply. It's not one of those exceptions. The first thing they look for is a categorical exclusion, a CATEX. These sound like a huge efficiency tool for an organization this size.
They are absolutely crucial for efficiency. CATEXs cover these categories of actions that, normally do not significantly affect the quality of the human environment.
Right, low impact stuff.
Exactly. So this avoids the need for full environmental assessments, EAs, or the even more extensive environmental impact statements, EISs, for routine low-impact activities.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Any DoD entity can use any DoD CATEX, regardless of which component originally set it up.
Yes, that's a fascinating detail. It means a CATEX established by, say, the Army for a certain type of routine maintenance.
Yeah.
Could be used by the Air Force or the Navy or any other defense agency for the exact same kind of action.
Wow, okay.
It promotes this broad applicability and, frankly, incredible efficiency across the whole department. Imagine the bureaucracy if every single branch had to reevaluate the same routine stuff independently.
Total nightmare. It standardizes things.
Exactly. Standardizes environmental compliance for common actions.
Speaking of the Army, let's dive into some of their CATEX examples. Because they seem really diverse, covering everything from just basic admin tasks to complex training. How do they handle routine administrative functions?
Well, yeah, this category includes a lot of the day-to-day work that keeps any huge organization running.
Like what?
Think about routine law and order stuff by military police or security forces,
Yeah.
or emergency assistance they might give to other government entities.
Okay.
Even preparing or revising regulations that just implement existing ones, or that really have no substantial environmental impact themselves. It covers internal admin activities, personnel management, budgets, communications, all within existing buildings.
So truly the basic operational stuff, but I noticed in the source, even for some of these simple things, they still need a bit more documentation, right?
That's a key point, yes.
Yeah.
Many of these, like getting approval for asbestos or lead-based paint management plans, or special events like air shows, or even just temporary road closures to protect wildlife. Those require something called a Record of Environmental Consideration, or a REC.
A REC. Okay, what is that exactly?
It's essentially just a signed statement. It briefly describes the action and confirms it qualifies for a CATEX after checking for any extraordinary circumstances. We'll get to those.
Okay,
It's basically their way of keeping a simple official record, a paper trail.
gotcha. And that cross-service use you mentioned, how does the REC fit in there?
Right. So if an Army action happens on, say, Navy property, they can use the Navy's CATEX or maybe a joint base's CATEX,
Oh, okay.
but it requires verification that the Navy, in this case, doesn't object. And you guessed it, REC.
Use the REC.
Use the REC. And the Army can also adopt another federal agency's CATEX if the action is pretty much the same. Again, needs a REC and documented confirmation. It's really a push for interagency efficiency, avoiding doing the same environmental review twice.
Makes total sense. Okay, let's move to something maybe more tangible. Construction and demolition. What kind of projects fall under a CATEX here?
This covers a pretty wide range of common construction or alteration projects. For instance, building new structures or adding on to existing ones, if it's on land that's already been disturbed,
Okay.
or even on undisturbed land, but only up to a certain limit, usually no more than 5 total acres of surface disturbance on previously untouched land.
5 acres. That's pretty specific.
It is. And this is generally for routine facilities. Importantly, it typically excludes facilities for solid or hazardous waste. Those usually need a closer look.
So if they're building, say, a new barracks on an already developed part of the base, or maybe a small training facility out in a field somewhere, that might qualify.
Exactly, yeah, as long as it's within those acreage limits.
Yeah.
Other common CATEXs in this area include building or expanding parking lots, putting up fencing, or installing utility systems if they use existing rights of way, or even just relocating machinery into new or altered buildings, assuming it's for similar uses. Demolition of existing buildings and getting rid of the debris is also frequently a CATEX.
But there's a catch for historic buildings.
Crucial safeguard, yes. For historic properties, anything on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, the requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA, must still be met separately.
Got it. So the CATEX doesn't override that.
Not at all, and almost all of these construction demolition CATEX typically require REC. Got to have that documentation.
It's clear these CATEXs aren't just for tiny things. They cover a lot. What about cultural and natural resources? How do CATEX apply there?
Yeah, here, a CATEX often covers actions aimed at actually improving or restoring the natural environment.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Think about regenerating native trees or vegetation, maybe post-fire rehab work, habitat improvement projects, provided it doesn't involve, like, heavy herbicide use or building more than a mile of new roads. It also includes restoring wetlands and streams, and even implementing hunting and fishing policies, as long as they align with state, local, and tribal rights.
And those generally need a REC, too.
Most of these, yes, require REC. It documents that the restorative action itself fits the exclusion.
What about studies or surveys, if they're just collecting data?
Good question. Minimally intrusive scientific studies, surveys, data collection, monitoring things like topographic surveys, bird counts, maybe wetland mapping, remote sensing. Those are often CATEXs.
Okay.
This allows them to gather vital environmental data without triggering a whole lengthy review process just for the act of collecting the data itself.
Right, that would slow things down.
It would. It also covers maintaining or repairing markers or fences used to protect archaeological sites, historical areas, or endangered species habitat.
Hmm.
And the regular updating of their Integrated Natural Resources Management Plans, INRMPs, which
Hmm.
are basically the DoD's playbooks for managing their natural assets. As long as the updates don't introduce new adverse effects, updating the plan itself can be a CATEX.
And most of these need a REC.
Many of these resource-related ones, yes, particularly the studies and INRMP updates, will require a REC.
Got it. Okay, moving on to procurement and product modifications. Now, this seems like an area where lots of small decisions could add up to a big environmental impact, just given the scale of DoD procurement.
It absolutely could. So this category covers routine procurement of goods and services, provided they comply with sustainable procurement guidelines.
Okay, so buying office chairs or basic supplies.
Right, buying standard office supplies or maintenance services generally won't need a full NEPA review. It also includes procuring, installing, or operating utility and communication systems if they use existing rights-of-way. Pretty standard stuff.
What about adapting commercial items for military use or modifying existing military gear?
That's a key area. Converting commercial activities to military ones without changing the mission or land use can be a CATEX.
Okay.
Think about taking a standard commercial truck and just painting it green, maybe adding some basic military comms gear, without fundamentally changing its environmental impact profile.
Right.
Similarly, modifying or improving existing military gear material, they call it like maybe upgrading the straps on a soldier's backpack or improving a radio's antenna.
Yeah.
If it doesn't change its original environmental footprint, that would also often fall under a CATEX.
Yeah.
Usually requires a REC, though.
So they can make necessary upgrades without constantly reassessing every minor design tweak from an environmental standpoint.
Exactly. That's the point. It allows for efficiency in keeping equipment up to date.
Okay. Next category, real estate transactions. This sounds like it could involve significant land changes, which seems like a tricky area for a CATEX.
It can be, but the key phrase here, as mentioned in the documents, no significant change in land or facility use. So this category covers common transactions, like granting, acquiring, or terminating leases, licenses, easements, things that just establish time periods for use, without altering the fundamental use of the land.
Right.
It also covers transferring administrative control of property within the Army, or maybe to another military department, or even another federal agency.
And these need documentation.
Typically, yes. These actions usually require REC, just to ensure there's a clear paper trail for the change in control or use rights.
Are there any actual land acquisitions or disposals covered by a CATEX? Selling or buying land seems like a bigger deal.
Yes, sometimes. For example, acquiring real property where the land use isn't going to change substantially from what it was before.
Okay.
Or if the land being acquired is relatively small, the Army source mentions less than 40 acres, and its intended use is similar to adjacent Army activities, that could potentially be a CATEX requiring a REC.
And disposal. Getting rid of property.
Same principle applies. Disposing of real property where the foreseeable future use isn't expected to change significantly from its current state could be a CATEX, again, needing a REC. And importantly, agreements under the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program, ACUB, which is a great program to limit incompatible development near installations.
Right, to protect training ranges and stuff.
Exactly, or preserve habitat. Those agreements are also often CATEXs if they don't involve a significant change in land use themselves. Needs a REC, of course. Allows them to be proactive about protecting buffer zones efficiently.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about the real bread and butter of daily operations, maintenance, repair, and infrastructure operations.
This is a huge category, and it really highlights the efficiency goal of CATEX. It includes just routine repair and maintenance of buildings, facilities, utilities, airfields, grounds, even targetry on existing ranges.
So fixing leaky roofs, patching roads.
Pretty much. And it specifically covers things like asbestos and lead-based paint removal. Those require REC. And even work on historic structures is included here, provided they comply fully with the National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA. That also needs REC.
Okay.
Routine repairs to existing roads, trails, fire breaks, grading, maybe minor resurfacing, cleaning out culverts, all covered.
What about equipment? That seems like another area with constant maintenance needs.
Absolutely. Routine installation, repair, and maintenance of equipment and vehicles. If it's similar to what you'd see in the private sector, that's generally a CATEX.
But not the really specialized military stuff.
Generally excludes the highly specialized depot maintenance of unique military equipment. That often gets a closer look. But routine vehicle maintenance, usually a CATEX.
Okay.
Even land repair projects designed to mitigate the effects of military training like soil stabilization, erosion control, controlling invasive vegetation, those can be CATEXs, typically requiring an REC. And just routine maintenance of streams, ditches, rainwater conveyance structures, or developing and implementing installation pest management plans, IPMPs, for using pesticides and herbicides according to plan.
Right.
All fall into this category, usually need a REC. But an important note here, this CATEX does not apply to aerial spraying of pesticides or herbicides. That's treated differently.
Good distinction. Wow, that's incredibly detailed. Okay, what about waste, hazardous materials, hazardous waste, and excess material? This sounds like a really critical area for environmental oversight.
It definitely is. This CATEX category includes things like the use of devices containing sealed radiological sources, maybe used in medical practices, or for industrial radiography. Those require a REC.
Okay.
Importantly, it also covers immediate responses to oil or hazardous material spills or releases if they're done according to pre-approved emergency plans, like an SPCC plan, and actions taken by explosive ordnance disposal, EOD, units, and emergencies.
So emergency responses are fast-tracked out of NEPA review. Essentially, yes. It allows for rapid necessary responses without environmental review delays getting in the way during an actual emergency.
Makes sense. What about finding out if contamination exists?
Right. Things like sampling, surveying, drilling wells, analytical testing just to determine if hazardous substances are present, those activities themselves are often CATEXs, usually requiring a REC.
But not the cleanup itself.
Well, interestingly, no REC is needed for cleanup actions taken under CERCLA, that's Superfund or RCRA corrective actions, because those laws have their own specific built-in environmental compliance and public involvement processes.
Ah, okay. Avoids duplication.
Exactly. Routine management of hazardous material or waste sink inventory systems, transportation, storage, recycling, that's also a CATEX, as long as it's done according to all the applicable regulations. And the reutilization, marketing, or donation of excess DoD property, even if the items initially contained hazardous materials that can be a CATEX too, provided they are adequately cleaned and the transfer complies with regulations. Okay. Finally, let's talk about the core mission stuff. Training, research, development, engineering, testing, evaluation, and demonstration, RDT&E, manufacturing, and human systems integration. Big category. What's covered here?
Right. So training that's entirely administrative or just classroom-based, that's an easy CATEX. No environmental impact.
Sure.
More broadly, military training, RDT&E activities, fielding new equipment. If it's conducted in or on existing military structures, ranges, maneuver areas, access-controlled facilities,
Okay.
and it's compatible with the current use, similar to ongoing activities, and follows all the established environmental procedures, then it's often a CATEX.
So standard troop maneuvers on an existing training range.
Exactly. This includes a wide array of common activities, live fire exercises on existing ranges, emergency response training using missiles or artillery projectiles but only within designated areas, simulated war games, tactical exercises up to brigade size. Many of these fall under a CATEX but typically require RDC.
That's a huge umbrella. What about flying activities, central to military ops?
Flying activities, both manned aircraft and UAVs, are often CATEXs if they comply with FAA regulations and stick to normal flight patterns.
Okay.
Even infrequent and temporary increases in air operations, say up to 50% more than usual for less than 30 days, can be a CATEX. Although, the sources note, repetitive increases might need a closer look. These usually need a REC. Operating small arms ranges on Army lands, routine operation of radar, sonar, other electromagnetic systems within military boundaries, as long as they conform to exposure guidelines. Also, often CATEX is needing a RIC. It's really about ensuring standard, predictable operations don't trigger unnecessary full-scale reviews every single time.
In research and testing, RDT&E can be pretty diverse.
It can. Research, testing, RDT&E, even some manufacturing or repair operations. If they happen at existing enclosed facilities, they're typically CATEXs.
Okay.
They usually require REC if the operations involve new uses of munitions, explosives, or hazardous materials, stuff not used there in the last 5 years, or if there's an expected radiation release. New RDT&E activities at established labs, if they're similar in type and scope to what's already done there, that's often a CATEX. And testing of soldier equipment, think chemical biological protection gear, mock training exercises, usually requires a REC.
Any other really specific test scenarios that show how granular these CATEXs can get?
Oh yeah, this is where you see the detail. For example, flight testing rockets, missiles, medium or large caliber ammunition.
Yeah.
There's a CATEX if it happens solely within military boundaries, over-established ranges, with landing and recovery in designated impact areas, and with EOD coordination for any debris.
Crucially, not nuclear or high-yield explosives, though, right?
Absolutely not. The CATEX explicitly excludes radiological, nuclear, or high-yield explosives testing. That always gets a much higher level of scrutiny.
Got it.
But that kind of conventional munitions testing, along with others like automotive testing for performance or reliability, or testing robotic vehicles and UAVs under controlled conditions, those often fall under CATEX, each with specific conditions and typically requiring a REC.
So it shows they've carefully thought through what routine testing really doesn't need a full EIS every time.
Exactly. They've categorized the predictable impacts.
So what does this all mean for other services? Is it just the Army with these super detailed lists, or do, say, the Air Force or Navy have their own unique CATEXs tailored to their missions?
Oh, definitely not just the Army. Many other DoD components have their own extensive lists of CATEXs. And as we touched on, there's also that formal mechanism for adopting CATEXs from other federal agencies, which really highlights interagency cooperation.
Right.
Yeah, the Department of the Air Force, for example, has many similar admin and operational CATEXs to the Army, but also some unique ones reflecting their mission.
Give us some Air Force specifics, especially concerning air operations, I imagine.
Exactly. For the Air Force, CATEX include things like relocating a small number of aircraft to a base if it doesn't significantly increase total flying hours or operations or substantially change flight tracks. Needs their equivalent of a REC, the AF Form 813, though. Also, those temporary increases in air operations we mentioned, less than 30 days, up to 50% increase. That's an Air Force CATEX, too. Flying activities dispersed over wide areas, even supersonic flying way up high over land above 30,000 feet, or over water. Those can be CATEXs.
Wow.
They even have CATEXs for things like asking the FAA to set up special use airspace or military training routes for subsonic flights, or participating in air shows and flyovers at non-Air Force events, assuming FAA coordination. Very specific to their domain.
Yeah, clearly. And the Department of the Navy, their CATEXs must involve ships and subs and maybe different training scenarios.
They absolutely do. While they share many common admin and maintenance CATEXs, the Navy's specifics include, for example, the routine movement of mobile assets, ships, subs, aircraft, maybe for repair, overhaul, disposal, etc., but only where no new support facilities are needed.
Okay.
They also cover things like temporary placement and use of simulated target fields out in the water, but only for non-explosive training or RDT&E.
What about getting rid of old naval vessels? That sounds like a huge environmental job.
It is, potentially. But the actual decommissioning or disposal of naval vessels or aircraft, when it's done in compliance with all the hazardous material regulations, is often a CATEX.
Streamlines it.
Right, streamlines managing that end-of-life equipment while still ensuring environmental safety protocols are followed. They also have CATEXs for hosting public events if no permanent infrastructure changes are needed, or military training on non-military land or water if it's consistent with how that land water is already used.
Interesting.
Even modernizing a range or training area can be a CATEX if it doesn't substantially change the type or tempo of operations happening there.
So it's not just about what an individual service does, but how they interact and adapt these rules. What about an agency like the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA? They deal with some really unique, high-consequence threats.
Right, DTRA. They share many common administrative and operational CATEXs. Some specific ones include administrative study efforts, monitoring. But here's a crucial point. These CATEXs require separate NEPA analysis if the study leads to proposals for further action.
Ah, okay. So the study itself might be excluded, but not necessarily what the study recommends doing later.
Exactly. It's a really important distinction. The CATEX covers the initial investigation, but not automatically the consequences or follow-on actions. Same applies to their CATEX for sampling or drilling wells that involves minor clearing if it leads to proposing further actions. That needs a separate NEPA review.
That's a key safeguard.
It is. Other DTRA CATEXs include things like temporary use of transportable power generators in previously disturbed areas, routine movement of sealed radioactive sources, and new construction or equipment installation up to that 5-acre cumulative disturbance limit, again with specific conditions, tailored to their mission.
And the Defense Logistics Agency, DLA, their mission seems incredibly broad supply and logistics for the entire DoD.
Yeah, DLA's CATEXs are categorized broadly: administrative, operational, maintenance, training. Many of their routine activities are CATEXs, things like managing and disposing of military items that need demilitarization, or the routine handling of hazardous materials according to regulations.
Makes sense for logistics.
It ensures that vast flow of goods and materials through the DoD supply chain can be managed efficiently, with environmental checks built into their standard procedures. Things like reutilizing, transferring, donating, or selling excess DoD personal property also typically fall under a DLA CATEX. Many require their specific form, the DLA Form 1664.
Got it. Then there's the Missile Defense Agency, MDA. Very specific focus there.
Right, MDA. They have similar admin and operational CATEX. And just like DTR, their CATEX is for things like sampling, drilling wells, physical testing. Those require a record of environmental consideration, or REC, and critically, further NEPA analysis if it leads to proposals for further actions.
Same caveat as DTRA then.
Exactly. The data collection itself is streamlined, but not automatically any subsequent construction or operations based on that data. Other MDA CATEX include installing or repairing utility systems using existing rights-of-way and new construction or alterations up to that 5-acre limit with similar conditions about compatibility and infrastructure.
And finally, let's touch on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USAD, specifically their Civil Works program. They're often involved in big civilian infrastructure projects, right? Dams, waterways.
Correct. Their Civil Works program has its own set of CATEXs. These often cover routine activities at completed Corps projects, things that just fulfill the project's authorized purposes.
Like what?
Standard operation and maintenance, erosion control, minor repairs or replacements of existing structures within the project footprint. Also includes minor maintenance dredging if they use existing disposal sites and have the required permits.
Okay.
Planning and technical studies are also often CATEXs, but only if they don't actually recommend authorization or funding for new construction. They might recommend further study, but not building something new.
So keeping existing infrastructure running, initial studies.
Exactly. Things that maintain the status quo or allow for preliminary investigation without committing to major new construction or environmental disturbance.
That's an incredible variety of actions across the DoD. But it's not just internal DoD CATEXs, right? You mentioned they can adopt CATEXs from other federal agencies. That seems like a really smart way to avoid reinventing the wheel.
That's absolutely right. It's consistent with NEPA itself,
Yeah.
Section 109. The DoD can formally adopt a CATEX that was established by another federal agency.
How does that work?
Well, the process involves identifying the CATEX they want to adopt, then consulting with the agency that originally established it to make sure it's actually appropriate for the DoD's proposed action.
Okay.
Then they have to provide public notice that they're adopting it and document the whole thing in their administrative record. It's a formal process, showing that interagency collaboration.
Can you give an example of that in practice?
Sure. A great example mentioned in the sources is the Air Force adopting CATEXs from NASA. These cover things like routine maintenance, minor construction, and ongoing operations at existing NASA facilities or NASA-funded facilities where the Air Force might be involved.
Okay.
Like that.
Makes sense.
Another one is DTRA, adopting a CATEX from the Department of Energy, DOE, specifically for installing, operating, and removing standard electric vehicle charging stations within already disturbed areas.
So they don't have to do a whole new environmental assessment for putting in EV chargers if DOE already figured out it's usually low impact.
Precisely. It avoids that redundant environmental assessment for common activities already vetted by another expert federal agency. Big efficiency gain.
That's a really comprehensive look at the CATEXs themselves. But okay, How do these fit into the actual NEPA process? Where's the rubber meet the road, and what are the safeguards? It sounds like a lot can be excluded.
Right. So the process is structured kind of in tiers. It starts with looking for a CATEX for those low-impact actions.
Step one.
Step one. If a CATEX doesn't apply, or maybe if the significance of the effects is unknown, it moves up to an environmental assessment, or EA.
Okay, EA is level 2.
Level 2. And then, if significant environmental effects are reasonably foreseeable, it moves to the highest level of review, an environmental impact statement, or EIS.
EIS is the big one. But what's the check on using this CATEXs in the first place? Because, like you said, it covers a lot, and you could worry about unforeseen impacts slipping through.
That's exactly where extraordinary circumstances come in. This is the crucial safeguard, the check.
Okay.
Even if an action seems to fit a CATEX description perfectly, these extraordinary circumstances can prevent the CATEX from being used, forcing a higher level of review, like an EA or EIS.
What counts as an extraordinary circumstance?
It includes things like the potential for substantial adverse effects on public health or safety, or if the project might violate federal, state, or local environmental laws, or if it's just much larger in scope or size than is typical for that category of action. or if it poses uncertain or unique environmental risks.
So if they're doing something routine, maybe maintenance, but it happens to be right next to, say, an endangered species critical habitat or a protected wetland.
Exactly, that's a prime example. Or if it could result in an uncontrolled release of hazardous substances. The key is the potential for substantial adverse effects on what NEPA calls sensitive resources.
Like endangered species, wetlands? What else?
Critical habitat, coral reefs, federally designated wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, national marine sanctuaries, sole source aquifers, parklands, archaeological resources, historic properties, basically ecologically or culturally important areas.
So the presence of one of these sensitive resources means they have to stop and think, even if the action itself seems minor.
Yes. They have to pause and specifically determine if using the CATEX is still appropriate in that context.
But here's an important nuance I saw. The mere presence of an extraordinary circumstance doesn't automatically kill the CATEX, right? How does that work?
That's a really key point for practicality. Just because, say, a historic property is nearby doesn't automatically mean you need an EA for routine lawn mowing next door.
Right.
The DoD has to determine, can the proposed action be modified to avoid those potential effects on the sensitive resource?
Ah, mitigation.
Right. If they can modify it and successfully mitigate the potential impacts, then the CATEX might still apply. Or they might determine that even with the extraordinary circumstance present, the proposed action genuinely isn't expected to result in significant impacts on that resource.
Okay.
But if the potential impact really can't be avoided or mitigated down to non-significance, then an EA or EIS must be prepared. The CATEX can't be used.
So there's definitely a safety net there. And how do they document these CATEX determinations? That seems really important for accountability, knowing a decision was made.
It absolutely is. Documentation is key. The DoD must document the application of a CATEX in its administrative record in specific cases, especially those needing that REC we talked about.
Right, the REC. Remind me what that is again for the Army.
For the Army and the Missile Defense Agency, it's primarily done using that record of environmental consideration, the REC. It's basically a signed memo. It briefly describes the action, says who's proposing it and who approved the CATEX use, clearly shows how the action qualifies for that specific CATEX number, and confirms that they've screened it for extraordinary circumstances and found none that would preclude the CATEX. It's a quick, clear paper trail, doesn't have a super strict format, but has to contain that core info.
And other services, do they use something similar?
Yes, similar concept, but often different forms. For the Air Force, as I mentioned, it's the Air Force Form 813, Request for Environmental Impact Analysis. That's a more formal legal document. Requires detailed info about the project, alternatives considered, and has a checklist section for potential environmental effects: positive, negative, none, unknown. Needs a chief signature.
Okay.
For the Defense Logistics Agency, it's the DLA Form 1664, which also requires project details, alternatives, and an environmental impact checklist.
So the documentation is pretty rigorous across the board, even for excluded actions.
Yes. It ensures accountability and transparency. It creates that clear public record showing that an environmental review, even if brief, actually happened.
What if a single larger action could potentially involve multiple CATEXs, say a construction project that also involves some administrative personnel changes and maybe some minor road maintenance nearby?
That happens all the time.
Oh.
Complex actions often have parts that fit different CATEXs. The DoD can apply multiple CATEXs to the different components of a single action, but they must consider whether the combined aggregate impacts of all those CATEX parts could, together, give rise to an extraordinary circumstance or potentially result in reasonably foreseeable significant effects overall. You can't just break a big project into tiny CATEXable pieces to avoid looking at the whole picture.
Right. Can't game the system that way. Okay, so if a CATEX doesn't fit or there are extraordinary circumstances, the next step is usually an environmental assessment, an EA. What do those involve?
Right. EAs are prepared for actions where the significance of the environmental effects is basically unknown, or if they're expected to not be significant, but a CATEX isn't quite appropriate for whatever reason.
And they're supposed to be concise?
Yes. Congress specifically directed that EAs must be concise. They generally include the purpose and need for the action, a description of the proposed action and reasonable alternatives, and an analysis of the reasonably foreseeable environmental effects.
And the main point is?
The core focus of an EA is really to determine whether those environmental effects are significant enough to warrant a full EAS, is that decision point.
And are there limits on EAs, too, to keep the process moving? Seems like a theme here.
Absolutely. Efficiency is woven throughout. There's a strict page limit. The main text of a standalone EA generally cannot exceed 75 pages.
75 pages, okay.
And appendices are strictly for supporting data, like raw numbers or maps, not for burying additional analysis to get around the page limit.
Got it.
There are also deadlines.
Yeah.
Generally, EAs should be completed within 1 year from the start date, though extensions are possible if there's a good reason, like needing more analysis.
Okay, so the EA is done. If it determines there are no significant effects, that leads to a finding of no significant impact, or a half-on SI, right?
Exactly. Finding of no significant impact. The F-on SI document must include or incorporate the EA by reference. It has to clearly explain the reasons why the DoD determined there will be no significant effect.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to state the authority for any mitigation measures they've decided to adopt, identify related documents, and clearly state that an EIS will not be prepared. It's the official sign-off saying, we looked, no major issues found.
And here's that aha moment again. The idea that significant effects can actually be reduced or mitigated down to a non-significant level, allowing them to use a mitigated F-on SI.
That's such a crucial point for efficiency and project implementation. It allows projects that might have initially had some significant impacts to still proceed without a full, lengthy EIS if those impacts could be successfully addressed and reduced through specific, committed mitigation measures that are documented in the F-on SI.
So mitigation makes a real difference in the process level.
A huge difference. And all F-on SIs have to be published on a publicly accessible website so the public can see the decision and the reasoning. Transparency.
But if the EA finds, or it's clear from the start, that there are reasonably foreseeable significant environmental effects, then it's time for the big one. An environmental impact statement, an EIS. Who makes that call? Seems like a major decision.
It is a major decision, and it's made by very high-level officials, typically an assistant secretary-level official in the military departments or a director-level official for defense agencies. For the Army Corps' civil works projects, it's the district commander. So senior leadership is involved.
And what goes into an EIS? It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is the most intensive level of NEPA review. An EIS is a detailed statement looking at all foreseeable environmental effects, both positive and negative, including any unavoidable adverse ones.
Mm-hmm.
It must also analyze a reasonable range of alternatives to the proposed action. These have to be technically and economically feasible alternatives and must always include the no action alternative. What happens if we do nothing?
Right.
It also has to discuss the relationship between short-term uses and long-term productivity, any irreversible commitments of resources, and importantly, identify means to mitigate the adverse environmental effects.
But again, NEPA doesn't require them to actually do the mitigation, just identify it in the EIS.
That's the key detail, often misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
NEPA itself mandates the analysis and identification of mitigation in the EIS, but it doesn't, on its own, authorize the DoD to impose those measures. Other laws or the agency's own decision might require mitigation, but NEPA's core function here is analysis and disclosure.
Got it. And I bet EIS have page limits, too.
They do. Even the most complex review has limits to maintain focus and efficiency. The main text of an EIS generally shouldn't exceed 150 pages. 150, okay. Now, for actions of extraordinary complexity, that can go up to 300 pages. But still, there's a limit. And like EAs, they have deadlines generally 2 years from publishing the Notice of Intent, or NOI, which formally kicks off the EIS process. Extensions are possible, but need justification.
And for these major EIS, there's a big emphasis on public involvement, right? More than for EAs.
Yes, significantly more formal public involvement. As soon as they decide an EIS is needed, the DID publishes that Notice of Intent, the NOI, on a public website.
Mm-hmm.
The NOI basically announces they're starting an EIS and actively requests public comment on the scope of the review, what alternatives should be considered, what potential effects are important, any relevant information the public might have. This public input is a critical part of shaping the EIS.
And the Army Corps has specific rules, too.
Yes. For Army Civil Works projects, the draft feasibility reports, which integrate the EA or EIS, have to be circulated for at least a 30-day public review and comment period. Public participation is baked in.
So with all these processes, CATEXs, EAs, EIS, ROKs, page limits, deadlines, what does this all mean for overall efficiency in environmental reviews across the massive entity that is the DoD?
Well, the DoD explicitly employs several strategies to make these reviews efficient, beyond just the CATEXs.
Like what?
They use programmatic environmental documents. For example, if they're starting a whole new type of program, they might do one big programmatic EIS or EA that covers the general impacts. Then subsequent site-specific actions under that program can potentially rely on or tier off that broader document, avoiding redundant analysis. These programmatic docs are usually good for about 5 years before needing reevaluation.
Okay, that makes sense. Reuse the analysis.
Exactly. They can also rely on existing environmental documents prepared by other agencies if the proposed action is substantially the same as what the other agency reviewed. Again, avoiding duplication. They can combine NEPA documents with other required environmental reports. And they heavily use incorporation by reference pointing to existing studies or data instead of reprinting pages and pages as long as the reference material is publicly accessible. All designed to cut down on bulk and redundant work while still meeting NEPA's requirements.
And at the very, very end of this whole rigorous process, whether it ended with a UF on SI or went all the way through an EIS, there's a final decision document, right?
Yes. For an action that required an EIS, the final step is the record of decision, or OD. The OD. It's a concise, public document. It summarizes the agency's final decision, identifies the alternative they actually chose to implement, discusses all the alternatives they considered, and specifies any mitigation measures that will be adopted and the authority for adopting them.
And who signs off on the RIT?
Again, very high-level officials, often assistant secretary level or equivalent. It shows top-level buy-in and accountability for major actions with significant environmental implications. And RITs are published on a public website and formally announced in the Federal Register. Maximum transparency for the biggest decisions.
And it's always a government official making the final call, right? Even if contractors help write the document.
Absolutely critical point. The entire NEPA process, preparing the documents, evaluating impacts, making the final findings like a F on SI or signing a RID is considered an inherently governmental function. Contractors can provide technical support, data analysis, drafting assistance, but only federal government officials can make the actual determinations and decisions.
So, wow. We've really navigated the complex, but as you said, incredibly structured world of the DoD's environmental procedures. From the efficiency of those categorical exclusions, streamlining routine tasks, right up to the detailed analysis and environmental assessments and environmental impact statements for the bigger projects.
Yeah, we've seen how really specific actions, everything from just routine admin work and maintenance up to major military operations, construction, testing, they're all meticulously evaluated within this framework.
What really stands out to me, I think, is the diligent effort to integrate environmental considerations into basically every level of decision making.
I agree. It ensures that even seemingly small actions get accounted for through things like RECs and CATEX screening,
Yeah.
and that the larger projects undergo this rigorous, publicly transparent review, and all within those strict deadlines and page limits we talked about.
It really feels like a testament to balancing these vast, critical operational needs with a clear, systematic commitment to environmental stewardship.
It's a complex balance for sure.
So here's a final thought to leave folks with. Considering the DoD's really systematic approach, categorizing, reviewing, documenting environmental impacts for literally thousands of incredibly varied actions, what could other large, complex organizations, maybe even big non-governmental ones, learn from this structured, compliance-driven framework to better manage their own broad range of impacts and responsibilities?
That's a provocative question. Could that level of structured environmental review be adapted outside of government? Interesting thought.